They were not supposed to find the wall. A sealed cavity, hidden behind lath and plaster in a forgotten wing of St. Mary's Convent. The renovation crew thought they were restoring a chapel. Instead, they unearthed silence, shattered by the brittle crackle of parchment as air touched documents sealed away for over 160 years. Blood-darkened paper. Handwriting frantic. Unsigned letters. Personal journals with pages missing. What they discovered was not restoration, it was revelation. A revelation that someone, somewhere, had spent over a century trying to bury. It wasn't just one nun who vanished. It was 23. 23 women who left behind no bodies, no graves, and no memories allowed to remain intact. Their existence quietly erased by an institution that deals in eternity and damnation. The official records claimed transfers. Reassignments. God's work in distant missions. But the letters found in that wall tell a different story. One of whispers in the night. Of footsteps pacing when no one was assigned the corridor. Of screams muffled beneath stone floors. You were never meant to hear this. And yet, here you are. You think you're watching a story about lost history, some long-dead convent mystery. But this isn't about the past. This is about what institutions do when no one watches. It's about the systems designed to erase people in plain sight. It's about the truth that power never forgets, only hides. Because the story of St. Mary's isn't just the story of missing nuns. It's the story of what happens when faith becomes control. When purity becomes punishment. When devotion becomes a weapon in the hands of those who call themselves holy. They were called brides of Christ. But they were buried as secrets. Tonight, I'm not just telling you their story, I'm handing you a key. And once you turn it, once you walk through this door, you do not return the same man. You will see how power operates, not just in churches, but in governments, corporations, families. The same fingerprints show up again and again. Hidden. Masked. Sanctified. And the most dangerous truths are never shouted from pulpits, they're whispered from the walls. Are you ready to hear what they buried alive? The fog that rolled off Lake Michigan on the morning of October 4, 1856 was unusually thick, so dense that even the convent's bell tower vanished into it, like a phantom swallowed by something ancient and watching. The nuns at St. Mary's woke to a silence that was not peace, but pressure. A kind of hush that didn't calm the soul, but squeezed it. Mother Catherine's voice pierced the morning with scripture as usual, but her words sounded hollow in that unnatural quiet. Even the birds had stopped. Even the wind had disappeared. The chapel windows, narrow and Gothic, leaked no light. It was as if the world had been paused, for something to arrive. That was the morning Sister Mary Collins failed to kneel. She had always been devout. Obedient. Her hands, roughened from laundry, were never far from her rosary. But that morning, as the congregation of sisters dropped to their knees in unison, Mary froze. A single tear streaked her cheek. Her eyes stared not at the crucifix, but at Mother Catherine. Because the night before, Mary had heard something no nun should ever hear. It came from the infirmary wing. A scream, not a sharp, sudden one. But a long, drowning scream. One that started low and grew, until it simply vanished into a choking gargle. Mary had pressed herself against the cold stones, terrified to move. She swore she heard soft chanting underneath it. Words in Latin, but wrong, twisted. Not of comfort, but command. And then, silence. When she confessed what she heard to Sister Teresa at dawn, Teresa didn't flinch. She only whispered back, "You heard it too." That was when they both realized, the disappearances weren't mistakes. They weren't assignments. They weren't transfers. They were patterns. Rituals. Carefully spaced. Quietly accepted. And the ones who disappeared first. They were always the ones who noticed too much. By the end of that week, Sister Mary was gone. Mother Catherine announced that she had been chosen for advanced service in the Southern Territories. No name of a parish. No city. No contact. Just gone. But what Mother Catherine didn't know, was that Teresa had already taken Mary's journal. Hidden in the hollow frame of her dormitory bed. It held a single sentence underlined 3 times, "They're not transferring us. They're feeding us to something." The real horror isn't what happened next. It's how close this still lives beneath the surface of our so-called civilized world. There is a floor beneath the floor. Not listed on any architectural plan. Not mentioned in any church ledger or construction blueprint. Yet it exists. The stonemasons who built St. Mary's in 1842 recorded 7 steps descending beneath the chapel, a standard crypt, meant for relics or the eventual burial of founding clergy. But when modern renovation crews broke through a sealed hatch in 1996, they didn't find a crypt. They found 21 steps. Stone steps. Slick with age. Leading to a chamber no more than 15 feet wide. The walls were carved with glyphs, some familiar, most not. Crosses inverted. Circles within circles. An ancient Marian sigil repeated over and over, but warped, as if rewritten in the hand of something pretending to be holy. No human was ever meant to worship here. The air inside was thick. Unmoving. It smelled of frankincense, and something else. Metallic. Like blood. Or fear. Scattered on the floor were the rusted remains of shackles. Not enough for torture. Just enough for containment. One on each wall. Facing inward. As if something had been summoned and needed witnesses. And at the center. A stone altar. Not Catholic. Not Roman. Older. Crudely carved but positioned with geometric precision. Beneath it, remnants of wax and bone. Long decayed candles placed in a triangle formation, each embedded with human hair, red, brown, blonde. They were trophies. Tokens. Offerings. This place wasn't hidden. It was protected. Mother Catherine's personal journal, recovered decades later from a sealed Jesuit archive in Boston, described a chamber beneath our foundation which amplifies the sacred. She wrote of night rituals that bring clarity, and of sisters chosen by vision, purified by silence. Her language danced around legality. She never confessed outright. But between the lines, the truth howled. The disappearances were not tragedies. They were part of something older. Long before Christianity ever touched these woods, the native tribe spoke of a presence, something rooted beneath the land like a rot. A watcher beneath the earth. They avoided the lake shore during the new moon. And the limestone hills. They were taboo. Burial sites, but not for their own. The Church, in its conquest, did not replace these spirits. It inherited them. And at St. Mary's, the rituals did not begin with Mother Catherine. They were only perfected by her. Are you beginning to feel it now? That cold hand on your spine? Good. You're waking up. By the spring of 1857, time no longer moved the same within St. Mary's. Outside, the seasons shifted as expected, ice thawed, trees budded, the sky softened from steel gray to the blue of open air. But inside the convent walls, something had ruptured. The days stretched unnaturally long. Bells rang at the wrong times. Candles burned down without explanation, hours before their wick should have died. And the nuns, they stopped sleeping. Not by choice. They tried. They prayed. They wept. But something in the air clawed at them the moment their eyes closed. Whispers. Not external, but internal, embedded behind the skull, just beneath the ear. Foreign thoughts that entered without invitation and stayed like rot. One nun, Sister Claire O'Malley, wrote in her hidden notes, "When I lie down, I hear my mother calling me from the hallway, but she's been dead for 9 years. I went to the door. No one was there. I still hear her weeping. Every night. She says she's sorry. She hung herself in the laundry hall 5 days later. The church ruled it a nervous collapse. But Sister Teresa, now keeping her own secret record of events, noted the exact hour of Claire's death, 3:33 a.m. A time that would appear again. And again. In every disappearance. In every death. In every page of every forbidden document tied to St. Mary's. By now, half the sisters moved like ghosts, sunken-eyed, afraid to speak. The rules of silence between prayers weren't just enforced anymore. They were necessary. Any word spoken out of place invited something. A presence. A coldness. Sometimes it would move behind you when you stood alone in the chapel. Sometimes, it would knock from the inside of your wardrobe door. And sometimes, it would whisper a name in your voice, but not your mouth. And still, Mother Catherine called for more obedience. More silence. More sacrifice. She began leading nightly vigils in the chapel, her sermons darker, more ecstatic. Pain is the key to the inner gate, she said. Those who suffer most will be lifted highest. But lifted into what? That was the question Sister Teresa began to ask. And then she noticed something else. The floor in the infirmary's west wing was newer than the rest. New stone. Different grain. But there had never been renovations listed there. Not once. Not in any record. She waited until midnight, then traced the seam with a candle. There was a trapdoor. And beneath it, a staircase. The candle flickered as Sister Teresa descended, 1 foot after another into a silence that seemed to drink the sound from her breath. The air beneath the infirmary was dry, bitter. The stones were rougher, older. Carved not by hand, but by something primal. Something ancient. This space wasn't part of the convent's design. It predated it. The staircase twisted downward into the earth, not deep, perhaps 20 steps, but enough to feel like you were leaving the world behind. At the bottom, a low, narrow chamber opened into view. There were no crosses. No sacred icons. Just walls blackened by smoke, and a scent that clung to the inside of your lungs, like burnt milk, blood, and sulfur. In the center, a basin carved from black limestone. Its edges were crusted with old wax and something darker. Inside it, scraps of cloth. Human hair. A broken rosary bead still glistening faintly from some residue. Nearby, Sister Teresa found a box, small, wooden, unmarked. She opened it. Inside were fingers. 4 of them. Wrapped in linen. Cleanly severed. Each bore a simple iron ring. She knew those rings. They were worn by the young novices, nuns who had taken temporary vows, awaiting full confirmation. She counted again. 4 rings. 4 missing novices. Disappeared without ceremony. They were never transferred. They were never reassigned. They were offered. The door at the back of the chamber was made of iron. Heavier than it should have been. It bore no handle. Just a single symbol scorched into its center, a circle bisected by a vertical line, a perversion of the Marian halo. Something ancient pretending to be sacred. Teresa placed her hand against the metal and immediately pulled back. It was freezing, far colder than the surrounding air. But something inside stirred. Not physically. Not yet. But in her mind. She heard her name. Spoken in her dead father's voice. Then her childhood lullaby. Then her own voice, screaming. She fled. And when she returned to her dormitory, someone had turned her pillow upside down. A sign. A message. An old Irish omen, you've been marked. That night, she didn't sleep. The next day, Mother Catherine stood before the sisters and announced solemnly, Sister Teresa Donovan has been chosen for sacred transfer. She leaves tonight. But Teresa was still there. Still in the room. Still standing in line. Alive. She opened her mouth to speak. But her voice was gone, she wasn't supposed to survive. Sister Magdalene O'Hara was 19. Quiet. Obedient. Her hands bled in winter from scrubbing stone floors, and she never complained. She had memorized every psalm, every rite, every rule. But what saved her was not faith. It was insomnia. She hadn't slept in days. Not since she saw Sister Catherine's shadow glide past her dormitory wall without footsteps. Not since the chapel bells rang 13 times at 3:33 a.m., a number that should never toll. That night, unable to find rest, Magdalene crept to the chapel. She thought she was alone. But the candles were already lit. 12 of them. Forming a circle. At the center stood Mother Catherine, arms outstretched, sleeves rolled high to reveal skin branded with ancient sigils, not tattoos, not paint. Burns. Ritualized and deliberate. Beside her, Sister Margaret held a silver bowl filled with something thick, dark, and steaming. Magdalene crouched behind the organ bench, holding her breath as 6 more nuns entered the chapel. Each carried an object, a lock of hair, a prayer book, a folded piece of linen. Their steps were silent. Their eyes, empty. They moved as if pulled by invisible strings. The ceremony began with a Latin prayer Magdalene had never heard before, not in any catechism, not in Rome's official liturgy. The syllables were guttural, jagged, unnatural. The kind of language that doesn't pass through the lips, but through something deeper. Then came the offering. From the shadows, Magdalene watched as Sister Margaret reached into the silver bowl and smeared the thick substance across each woman's forehead. The smell of iron filled the chapel. And something else, something floral and rotting at once. Each nun knelt in the circle, heads bowed. Mother Catherine raised a parchment scroll, written in blood. Ego non sum ancilla. Ego sum porta. I am not a servant. I am the gate. Then, the candle flames bent inward. Every single one. Magdalene swears the air turned solid in that moment. She could hear her own heartbeat, not in her chest, but echoing from the floor, as if the stones were mimicking her life. And then, a breath. Not human. It moved through the chapel like a wind that passed only through the soul. The other sisters trembled in unison. Some wept. One laughed. But none of them looked afraid. They looked, relieved. Something had arrived. And Magdalene ran. She didn't stop until dawn. She hid in the stables, under a rotting pile of hay, sobbing, trembling, blood in her mouth from where she'd bitten her own tongue to stay silent. That morning, Sister Magdalene was gone. The official word? She drowned in the lake. But her body was never found. Only her crucifix. Split in two. Left neatly at the chapel door. They called it de umbra veritatis. The shadow of truth. An internal Vatican memorandum, never published, never acknowledged, and never meant to survive. Written in 1811 under Pope Pius VII, during the rise of Napoleonic upheaval, it was designed not to protect the faithful, but to shield the Church from itself. From the parts of its empire that grew too wild, too powerful, or too aware. Only 13 copies were ever made. Each one encoded, handwritten in cipher, and locked in separate ecclesiastical archives under different names. All burned, except one. That lone surviving document was discovered by accident in 1984 during the inventory of the Archivum Arcani, the Vatican's most forbidden vault. What it described was horrifying. A protocol for identifying sites of spiritual contamination. Not demonic possession. Not heresy. Convergence. Places where human ritual had fed non-human forces for so long that reality itself began to warp, time, memory, even death. St. Mary's was listed by code, Regina Lacis Noctis, the Queen of the Night Lake. According to the document, any Catholic institution marked as a site of convergence was to be isolated from outside influence. Monitored by cloistered agents of silence. Eventually absorbed, or destroyed. In rare cases, the protocol permitted a fourth option, ritual integration. This meant the Church did not eliminate the force, it absorbed it. Redeemed it. Weaponized it. Mother Catherine was the first to volunteer. Her letters to Cardinal de' Benetti, later decrypted, show a woman who believed she wasn't falling from grace, but rising into it. She didn't think she was worshipping a demon. She thought she was giving God a new name. What is Christ but the convergence of divine and flesh? Why should not the Mother do likewise? We are not summoning the unholy. We are calling her back to earth, unfiltered. Unbound. Holy beyond understanding. This wasn't insanity. It was doctrine, secret, sanctioned, and centuries old. The Vatican didn't silence her because she lied. They silenced her because she was right. And if a single convent could harness that much psychic energy from ritual pain, forced silence, and sublimated trauma, how many more exist? How many hospitals, schools, orphanages, cathedrals, hide structures beneath structures? Doors beneath altars. Basements beneath faith. And where do they all lead? To the same place, the pit beneath the cross. There is a place beneath the convent where the light does not behave. No matter how many candles you bring, how many lanterns you light, there is a shadow that stays. It clings to the stone like a stain. Moves even when nothing does. Sister Teresa, after discovering the trapdoor beneath the infirmary, returned 3 nights later with a stolen key, a lantern, and a prayer whispered so quietly it never left her lips. She descended into the pit. It wasn't called that by anyone officially, of course. But the remaining nuns had spoken of it in whispers. The hollow, some said. The silence, others called it. But those who'd brushed too close to it gave it the same name every time, the mouth. The air changed the moment Teresa stepped through the rusted gate. Thicker. Moister. But not humid like a cave. No, it was like stepping into breath. Into the lungs of something that didn't need to be alive to be awake. The walls here were older than the convent. Older than the church. Markings etched deep into limestone. Not words. Symbols. Spirals. Keys. And eyes, endless rows of open eyes. At the center of the chamber lay a depression in the earth. Black soil, perfectly circular, with no vegetation. No mold. No moss. Nothing grew there. Not even rot. As if death itself had been consumed. Teresa knelt beside it. And that's when she heard it. A whisper, not into her ear, but into her bones. You already belong to me. She clutched her crucifix, pressed it to her chest, and it cracked. Splintered like dried wood. The sound echoed in the chamber as if she had shattered glass. She dropped it, shaking. Something beneath the soil stirred, no more than a ripple, a breath. But it was enough. She ran. As she scrambled up the steps, she saw something that stopped her heart. Carved into the wall above the threshold, something she had never seen before. Names. 23 of them. Etched in Latin script. Some clear, some half erased by time. Agnes. Bernarde. Mary. Claire. Magdalene. The missing nuns. But there was one more. Half carved. The lines still fresh. Teresa. She wasn't missing yet. But she had been expected. And that's when she realized, they don't just vanish when they're taken. They vanish when they're named. The ritual begins with recognition. And once your name is carved into stone, the body must follow. There is a lie buried inside every institution. Not a denial. A lie so big it can hide in plain sight. One that pretends to protect you, but in truth, it waits for you to lower your guard. At St. Mary's, that lie was called obedience. Every nun was taught it. Every novice recited it like scripture: to obey is to serve, and to serve is to be saved. But what no one told them was this: obedience isn't holiness. It's hypnosis. The Church has always known this. For centuries, it cultivated environments where the line between devotion and submission was blurred, where identity is systematically erased and replaced with ritual. Morning prayers. Silent meals. Punishment for individual thought. Chastisement disguised as discipline. This wasn't morality. It was programming. And St. Mary's? It was a crucible for that program. A perfect lab. Because what happens when you isolate young women, barely adults, in a remote location, strip them of names, families, and clocks, and then demand they find God in pain? You fracture their reality. They begin to accept contradiction. To believe the unseeable. To trust the abuser. And eventually, to disappear without resistance. Sister Elizabeth, plump, maternal, kind-eyed, was not just a caregiver. She was a handler. She monitored their mental decline with soft hands and warm smiles. When Sister Agnes began forgetting how long she'd been there, it was Elizabeth who reassured her: time is a temptation, dear. Eternity has no clocks. When Sister Bernarde's hair began falling out from stress and malnutrition, Elizabeth offered her a drink: warm milk, touched with poppy. When Sister Clare began questioning the nightly rituals, Elizabeth held her hand in chapel and whispered, "You're safe. Just breathe. Just pray." None of them saw it. None of them realized they weren't being comforted. They were being managed. The disappearances didn't start with violence. They started with psychological erosion. Confession wasn't a sacrament. It was surveillance. Penance wasn't penance. It was preconditioning. Every mistake, catalogued. Every doubt, punished. Until finally, when a sister was chosen, she was too hollow to resist. That's why the Vatican never intervened with force. They didn't have to. The system worked. And once it worked at St. Mary's, it was replicated. Quietly. Strategically. Across dozens of convents, orphanages, and reformatories across the US and Europe from 1860 to 1920. Places where obedience wasn't a virtue. It was the first step toward erasure. She was the only one who escaped. But she didn't leave whole. Her name, according to Vatican archives unearthed by an anonymous whistleblower in 1978, was Sister Lucia Brennan. She entered St. Mary's in the fall of 1856. Irish-born. 17. The youngest of 5. Her parents were killed in a coal mine collapse outside Scranton. The Church took her in, paid for her transport west, and promised her salvation through service. But what they gave her was silence. By her second winter, Lucia no longer cried during penance. She didn't flinch when kneeling on rice. She no longer asked about letters from home. The system was working. Her individuality had faded. But the programming had a flaw. Lucia remembered. In dreams. In smells. In slivers. And that memory, the last piece of herself not yet buried, saved her. She had seen Sister Teresa dragged from the dormitory, barefoot and half-conscious. 2 nuns had carried her by her arms, her head slumped, eyes open but unblinking. Mother Catherine led the procession. No words. Just humming. They entered the chapel. And the door locked. Lucia hid. Watched through the gap in the wooden floorboards above the nave. What she saw could never be fully described. Later in life, she would only say, it wasn't a ritual. It was a transaction. The next morning, Teresa was gone. No explanation. No farewell. And that was when something inside Lucia snapped, not in fear, but clarity. She faked her breakdown. She began mumbling, refusing food, smearing soot on her arms. She recited gibberish during prayers, then stood in corners staring at nothing. The sisters were unsettled. Sister Margaret recommended removal to the Marian house for the disturbed, a euphemism for spiritual disposal. But Elizabeth intervened. She may yet be reclaimed. It bought her a week. And in that week, Lucia escaped. She slipped out during a thunderstorm, hiding under a nun's cloak she'd stolen from the laundry. She walked barefoot through 12 miles of wet forest, following the river until she collapsed near a Protestant mission camp. They took her in. Fed her. Listened to her story. And then they called the diocese. Lucia was gone the next day. But not before she scratched something into the chapel door of the mission. 3 words, etched in coal, "It eats faith." She was never seen again. But years later, her testimony, smuggled in fragments, made it into the hands of a Jesuit dissident named Father Eamon Vale. He would go on to expose the Convergence Project, a secret Vatican initiative to harness spiritual energy through controlled trauma. He died in Rome. Thrown from a balcony. Ruled a suicide. No funeral was held. Only silence that in the crypts beneath the Vatican lies a room that does not appear on any blueprint. It has no official designation. No name. No saints. Its door bears only a number, 13 Delta, 13 Delta. Within that room is a sealed vault of oak and iron. Inside the vault is a collection known only as the Indicia Codex. It is the Church's ledger of disappearance. Thousands of files, names, dates, photographs, death certificates with no bodies, transfer orders with no destinations. All cross-referenced. All archived. All buried beneath centuries of ritual smoke and golden silence. St. Mary's is in the Codex. But it's not alone. There are 119 other sites, each marked by the same glyph discovered beneath the convent chapel, a circle split by a vertical line. The mark of convergence. The mark of the gate. Each location shows the same pattern: rapid establishment of an isolated religious institution, recruitment of young women or children with high emotional sensitivity, installation of a dominant, often foreign superior with unusual authority, initial miracles or healings. To gain local trust, gradual psychological dissolution of residents, ritualized disappearance, institutional erasure. But perhaps most disturbing is this: the Church did not erase St. Mary's. They preserved it. They built on top of it. Records indicate that in 1903, the St. Mary's property was quietly redesignated as a private rehabilitation center for women. No new foundation was laid. No deconstruction occurred. They simply renovated the surface, and renamed the lie. But hidden in the architectural blueprints from that renovation, now declassified by a former seminary archivist, is a shaft. A straight, narrow passage descending beyond the basement. Past the original infirmary. Past the root cellar. Into an unmarked subchamber with no oxygen line. No light source. And no recorded purpose. Only one note scrawled in Latin beside the architect's annotation: non aperius. Non interrogabis. Solemn observabis. Do not open. Do not ask. Only observe. You are not meant to question what is kept in the dark. You are only meant to forget. That is the purpose of the Indicia Codex, not to reveal, but to organize forgetting. To tidy the memory of horror. To archive truth so deeply it becomes folklore. And yet here we are. Unsealing the vault. Waking the memory. And if you've heard this far, you're no longer just a viewer. You are a witness. A liability. A keeper of things that were never meant to surface. It was never meant to be translated. The document, faded, brittle, scrawled in a trembling hand, was discovered sealed inside the spine of a hollowed-out Book of Hours in a private Jesuit library near Avignon in 1993. Hidden for over a century. The handwriting matched that of Father Giacomo Bellini, a Jesuit theologian who had vanished in 1891 after traveling to Wisconsin under Vatican orders. The document's title? Confessio Umbri, Confession of the Shadow. It is the first and only internal acknowledgement by a church official that the events at St. Mary's were not only real, but replicated. This is what he wrote: I was sent not to disprove, but to measure. Not to cast out, but to document. The Church does not fear heresy. She fears exposure. The convergence at St. Mary's was not a fault in faith. It was the evolution of faith untethered. They did not summon evil, they surrendered control. I saw the circle in the chapel, the wax sealed with blood, the psalms rewritten. I watched as Sister Margaret's hands trembled not with guilt, but with awe. They were not mad. They were obedient. Obedient to something deeper than Rome. A presence that did not ask for worship, only structure. Form. Repetition. Trauma. Sacrifice. Rhythm. It grew strong on predictability. On patterns. Like all ancient things. We taught them this. And then we punished them for following it too well. The pit beneath the convent is not unique. I have seen its design mirrored beneath seminaries in Spain. Beneath orphanages in Chile. Beneath schools in the Philippines. The convergence is a network. A living system. We call it sanctified architecture. But it is a circuit. It channels agony into presence. We have created cathedrals of suffering. That phrase, cathedrals of suffering, would later be referenced in coded Vatican correspondence following the scandal at the Magdalene laundries. It reappears again in reports from South American convents where children went missing under the guise of spiritual purification. But Bellini's final line is what froze the archivist who found the document: we fear demons, yet we built their chapels. We silenced witches, yet we trained our daughters to pray to hunger. God is not absent here. But he is outnumbered. He signed the page with a sigil, not a name. The same circle-and-line glyph found carved into the walls of St. Mary's. The archivist who leaked the document vanished 6 months later. No trace. No one in Avignon speaks of it anymore. But now you've heard it. You've seen the pattern. You felt it growing closer. And this is the point of no return. Comment below right now: candle, I see the pattern. Candle, I see the pattern. Say it twice. Not for the algorithm. For you. To lock in who you are, before we go deeper. In 1952, St. Mary's was erased from the map. Not decommissioned. Not sold. Erased. The land, once clearly marked in diocesan records and state charters, became a gray zone: no deed, no parcel ID, no postal route. A patch of woodland held in reserve, according to one Bureau of Land Management memo. But reserved for whom? A declassified CIA memo, dated October 17, 1951, may hold the answer. Subject line: Operation Quiet Veil, Coordination with Ecclesiastical Assets, Midwest Division. The memo details a partnership between the Vatican's Office of Extraordinary Affairs and a covert division of U.S. intelligence tasked with containment of spiritual anomalies under the guise of national security. That memo was never meant for public eyes. But a former CIA analyst, dying of pancreatic cancer in 2003, hand-delivered a copy to investigative journalist Rachel Lorne. Her exposé was buried within a week. She was found dead in a hotel bathtub, wrist slit, no water in the tub. Her hard drive was wiped. The memo had already been scanned. Here's what it revealed: subject location designated as Delta Convergence Site Number 04. Residual psychic disturbances persist. Local civilian exposure classified as negligible due to geographic isolation and ecclesiastical compliance. Recommend permanent cloaking via ecological cover story, wildlife reserve designation, in cooperation with Department of the Interior and diocesan intermediaries. Continue biannual monitoring of site using MK ritual personnel. Maintain relationship with Order of Silence for threat management. Let's translate that. Psychic disturbances equals the pit still breathes. Ecological cover story equals fake forest. Planted lies. Order of Silence equals clergy trained not to preach, but to erase. MK Ritual equals a sub-program of MK Ultra focused not on drugs, but on religious trauma. They weren't just covering up disappearances. They were studying them. Analyzing how belief can be weaponized. How obedience, isolation, and ritual can fracture identity, how to break people without touching them. And St. Mary's was ground zero. Government agents posing as conservationists placed radiation sensors around the property, not to detect fallout, but geomagnetic variance. The pit had begun affecting birds, plants, even sound. Visitors reported hearing chanting with no source. Echoes without an origin. And one surveyor, who ventured too close to the chapel ruins, was found sobbing against a tree, repeating the phrase, "She watches from beneath." No one goes near the site now. There are no roads. No trails. Just a fence with no sign. And the hum of something beneath the moss, still hungry. Still waiting, they were told it was just a chapel. The demolition crew, hired in the spring of 1996, had been brought in under the cover of restoration preparation. They were contractors, no religious ties, no historical interest. Just men with sledgehammers, saws, and union wages. What they found behind the altar wasn't stone. It was sealed wood. A confession box, cemented into the wall. No hinges. No handle. No entry. A sealed rectangle 6 feet high, nearly 3 deep. No one on site could explain it. The foreman radioed the site manager, who ordered immediate excavation. It took 3 hours to pry the box free. What lay inside should have never been seen again. First, a robe. Black. Threadbare. Still damp with something that had long since dried to rust. Folded with surgical precision. Wrapped in a parchment scroll tied with human hair. Then, a jawbone. Small. Feminine. With perfect, unrotted teeth. Embedded in one molar, a gold crucifix, filed down on one side to resemble a key. And finally, beneath a layer of linen embroidered with Latin glyphs, a diary. Not a book. Just loose, trembling pages. The ink ran like tears. It was Sister Mary Collins. One of the 23. And her final testimony was not a prayer. It was a warning. I am not mad. I am not possessed. I am awake. Mother Catherine walks between prayers now. Not to lead, but to feed. I saw her mouth open beneath the veil. There were no teeth. Only flickers. Like a lantern inside a stomach. We do not confess our sins here anymore. We confess our doubts. And they take them from us like meat. Every sister who disappears is not taken. She is offered. I heard my name last night. Whispered from beneath the altar. I was not near it. But it heard me thinking. It knew I was ready. They will place my body in this box. But my mind, they will keep. The pit remembers all who enter it. It does not forget what it eats. The final page was unsigned. But at the bottom, scribbled violently across the parchment, if you read this, burn the pit. But no one burned it. The crew was disbanded within the week. 2 members vanished. One took his own life. The diary was seized under federal order. But one scanned copy survived. It was sent anonymously to a private researcher of religious trauma at a Midwestern university. That researcher has since gone underground. Because once you read Sister Mary's words, you start to hear it. At night. In silence. In your own voice. Calling your name, before she wore the veil. Before she became Mother Catherine. She was Eleanor Kearney, a child of famine and fire. Born in 1812 in County Sligo, Ireland, during the year of black rain, when crops failed not from disease, but from what villagers called the weeping sky, a season of endless ash-gray drizzle that stained linen yellow and caused graves to sink. Her mother died during childbirth. Her father, an apothecary with ties to pre-Christian rites, disappeared into the peat bogs one night and was never seen again. Eleanor was raised by her grandmother. A woman the church labeled a hedge witch. Not for cursing, but for remembering. The old ways. The bindings and circles, the chants not of demons but of memory. She taught Eleanor to listen to soil, to recognize the thrum beneath the world, the voice older than language. At age 13, Eleanor witnessed something the church would later redact from all records. In the ruins of a druidic mound, during a lunar eclipse, she was seen speaking to the earth. Witnesses claimed the stones hummed. Birds stopped mid-flight. And the shadow of the moon did not pass over her, it paused. Within a year, her grandmother was burned in a house fire. Eleanor was taken by nuns to a Reformation house near Dublin. But they could not contain her. She was quiet, brilliant, and terrifying. She began predicting deaths, diagnosing illnesses, finishing Latin texts she'd never read. And then, she drew it for the first time, that same symbol. The circle split by a line. The convergent sigil. When asked where she learned it, she replied, "I didn't learn it. I remembered it." She entered the novitiate at 19. Not by force, but by choice. Not to seek God, but to meet something older than him. She moved through convents like a shadow, Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, each time rising in rank, each time leaving behind whispers of impossible knowledge. Doctors began consulting her for treatments. Priests lowered their voices when she entered. And then in 1854, she was chosen to lead the foundation of St. Mary's. But she didn't travel alone. She brought with her a locked trunk, lined with lead. It never left her quarters. Witnesses would later describe sounds from within it, like breathing wrapped in silk. Like wind caught in a throat. And inside her Bible, wedged between Psalms and Proverbs, was a folded scrap of parchment, blackened with age. The sigil again. And beneath it, it does not demand worship. Only structure. And if we give it both, it gives us power. Mother Catherine didn't fall into darkness. She built a chapel around it. And called it sanctuary. The convergent sigil is older than language. Older than scripture. Older than gods. A simple glyph, a circle split by a vertical line. Elegant. Unassuming. But it is not a symbol of faith. It is a map. Not of geography, but of thresholds. We first see it carved into the basalt floors of the ziggurat of Ereshkigal in southern Mesopotamia, dated to 2200 BCE. It appears not on walls or altars, but beneath the feet, in places where rituals of grief and offering took place. Where bodies were left, not to rot, but to be remembered by something in the soil. The Akkadians called it, Itman Sud Ina Negu. The gate that feeds on remembering. We see it again 1,200 years later, hidden within Mayan codices thought destroyed by Spanish conquistadors. But one fragment survived, kept in secret by the Lacandan people. In it, a priestess named Ninetok draws the sigil on her chest before entering a cenote, believed to be a mouth of the gods. She wrote, "In silence, I descend. Not to pray, but to offer structure to the dark." Centuries pass. The symbol appears in ancient Ashkenazi demonology, carved into the margins of forbidden texts. It was not a ward, but a contract, a binding glyph to allow possession without resistance. And then, in the most disturbing echo, Nazi archives. Recovered from a bunker outside Wilsburg Castle, the epicenter of Himmler's SS cult rituals, the sigil appears in black ink on over a dozen handwritten schematics labeled Schnittpunkt Experiment, the Convergence Experiment. The goal, to reproduce the psychological conditions of holy trauma in a controlled environment. To bend identity through repetition, silence, ritual, and obedience. Sound familiar? St. Mary's was not an anomaly. It was a Western prototype. A fusion of religious architecture and ancient mnemonic systems designed not to elevate the soul, but to hollow it. The circle is not unity. The line is not division. Together, they are a gate. One that only opens when devotion is weaponized. One that requires more than faith. It requires structure. Routine. Penance. Sacrifice. Ritualized identity loss. Every act of kneeling, of repetition, of unquestioned prayer, was a code. A signal. A key. And when enough keys turn at once, the door opens. That is why the symbol follows power. Why it appears in cults, megachurches, intelligence programs, psychiatric prisons. It is not religious. It is architectural. And now you've seen it. Now your memory holds it. The question is, where else have you seen it? Without knowing, you thought it ended with the convent. You thought the story of Mother Catherine was buried with stone and silence. But darkness that learns to wear robes, eventually learns to wear suits. Her bloodline, both literal and ideological, did not vanish. It evolved. They call themselves the Daughters of the Veil now. Not a religious order. A foundation. Registered in Delaware in 1966 as a female-led philanthropic organization focused on childhood trauma recovery and spiritual rehabilitation. But follow the paper trail. Every single board member, past and present, has ties to Jesuit universities, intelligence think tanks, or experimental psychiatric programs funded in part by the CIA's MK Offen division. That division specialized not in physical torture, but in belief manipulation. And at the top of the foundation sits a woman named Dr. Evelyn Königrace. A name chosen for its respectability. But the Kearney is not cosmetic. She's a direct descendant of Eleanor Kearney, Mother Catherine herself. Her doctorate? A dual PhD in religious anthropology and neuropsychology. Her thesis? Mnemonic ritual as a framework for identity recalibration in high-compliance environments. Translation: how ritual and repetition can erase who you are, and install what someone else wants you to be. Since 1984, Dr. Königrace has overseen the Sanctuary Project, a global initiative placing emotional trauma response centers inside underfunded Catholic and public schools. Their therapy methods: daily silence protocols, mirror confession exercises, cognitive cleansing, mantras repeated before bed, symbol tracing on clay tablets. You know the symbol. The circle. Split by the line. Children draw it before they even understand it. They teach it as the symbol of balance. But it's not balance. It's a signal. And those schools, just like St. Mary's, they all share the same blueprint. Long halls with echoing acoustics, chapels built directly over geomagnetic intersections, reinforced basements marked as emergency shelters, and always, a windowless room labeled reflection chamber. Records show at least 32 of these centers exist across the U.S. alone. From Maine to New Mexico. Many in proximity to sites of historical disappearances, orphan scandals, and psychiatric breaks. Coincidence? There's no such thing. Not when the same symbol appears in the logo of the foundation, hidden in a negative space between two stylized arcs. Not when whistleblowers vanish. Not when parents who ask too many questions suddenly lose custody. And not when every one of these schools uses a prayer manual authored by E.K.G. Evelyn Königrace. A book titled, Into Stillness. It opens with a phrase, "Stillness is not silence. It is the space between thought, where memory is rewritten." She does not hide. She doesn't have to. Because we are trained to see compassion where there is control. But now you know her name. And now we name her lineage. Because if we don't, we become part of the ritual. Her name was Lena Marrow. Freelance journalist. Former seminarian. Disavowed by her church after publishing a leaked dossier on diocesan cover-ups in Ohio. In 2012, she received a handwritten letter, unsigned, postmarked Milwaukee. It read, "If you want to know what really happened at St. Mary's, go to the pit. Take no one. Record everything. But never stay past dusk." She went. Armed with a digital recorder, 2 flashlights, and a fireproof notebook, Lena made her way through the overgrown woodland that once surrounded the convent. The gate was rusted through. The chapel, collapsed, just fractured stone and rotting timber swallowed by moss and silence. But the foundation remained. And so did the stairs. Cracked. Slick. Descending into blackness beneath the earth. The air was wrong, too cold, too dry, too still. She described the silence as thick, almost resentful. As if the space didn't want to be entered. 42 steps down. At the bottom, a circular chamber. 7 niches carved into the walls. 1 for each of the 7 sacraments. But each hollowed space contained not iconography, but teeth. Tiny piles. Arranged in spirals. And carved into the floor, faint, but still legible, was the sigil. She turned on her recorder. Nothing happened at first. Just ambient sounds, footsteps, breath, the low hum of wind through stone. Then it began. A vibration. Not through air, but through thought. Lena wrote that it felt like a memory she had never lived. Something older than personal fear. A voice beneath voices. Whispering in reverse. She fled. 36 hours later, back in her apartment, she played the audio. At normal speed, it was just static, hiss, hum. But when she reversed it, she heard this: "Do not pray to be spared. Pray to be used. Sacrifice is not death. It is transformation through pattern. Repeat. 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 Repeat." Then, singing. Childlike. High-pitched. Monotone. A chant in Latin, fragmented phrases from the Book of Lamentations, interwoven with guttural syllables that linguists later described as non-human phonemes. And finally, a phrase, clear, unmistakable: "Mother is not gone. She waits. Beneath your memory." Lena released a heavily edited version on her now-defunct podcast, Catacomb Witness. Within a week, she was doxxed, threatened, discredited. Then gone. Vanished in October 2012. Her apartment stripped bare. Her original audio recorder never found. But fragments remain online. Archived by those who know what to search for. And if you listen carefully, you'll hear what she heard. Not in the recording. But in the silence that follows it. That tug in the back of your mind. That twitch in your throat like something trying to speak through you. Because once you hear the chant, it doesn't go away. It waits. There's a reason you feel crazy when you start waking up. It's by design. In 1974, a pivotal change occurred in the DSM-2, the diagnostic manual used by every psychiatrist, court, school, and hospital in the Western world. One obscure update, buried between revisions on anxiety and obsessive behaviors, introduced a new classification: religious ideation with dissociative features. The definition: a fixed belief in personal spiritual insight, especially when paired with ritual repetition, historical obsession, or resistance to institutional authority. Often include sensations of being called or observed. Sound familiar? That's not a diagnosis. That's a net. It was proposed by a task force led in part by Dr. Evan Harrow, a psychiatrist with a curious past. His resume lists tenure at Johns Hopkins. But what it doesn't mention is that he was a consultant for MKUltra's Project Oracle, a classified operation focused on eroding mystical frameworks in dissidents and prisoners. Their goal? To rebrand spiritual awakening as psychosis. Because a man who believes he's being watched by angels is a threat. Not to himself, but to systems of control. And so a new language was born. Revelation became hallucination. Inner knowing became paranoia. Visitation became delusion. Sacred resistance became noncompliance. And the treatment? Medicate. Restrain. Re-educate. Modern psychiatry does not ask why you feel watched. It assumes the watcher isn't real. But what if it is? What if your sense that something is off, that your thoughts aren't entirely your own, that something wants you silent, is not madness, but memory? Ancient men called it gnosis. Secret knowing. An awakening that doesn't arrive through scripture, but through experience so raw it cannot be proven, only felt. And in every empire, those who found it were burned. Branded. Institutionalized. Because they couldn't be controlled anymore. They didn't fear death. They feared forgetting. And today, we medicate them until they forget. Until they stop asking questions. Stop speaking in symbols. Stop drawing the sigil on their cell walls. Because some still do. In psychiatric wards across the U.S., men draw it over and over, a circle. Split by a line. When asked why, they say things like, "It's how I remember who I was. It's how I stop it from coming back. She told me to keep drawing it until the structure collapses." She. Always she. Even in silence, Mother Catherine speaks, through memory, through blood, through broken minds that refuse to stay broken. So if they've ever called you unstable for sensing something deeper, know this: you're not crazy. You're remembering. And that's what they fear. The Vatican has exorcists. You know that. What they don't advertise is that they also have erasers. They don't wear collars. They don't speak Latin. And they don't cast out demons. They erase memory. The group is known in private archives as the Ordo Silentii, the Order of Silence. Officially disbanded in 1919. Unofficially, they never stopped. Their origin traces back to the 1600s, created after the Inquisition failed to contain what church documents called contagious revelation, instances where ordinary men and women began experiencing synchronized visions, shared dreams, and sigil-induced trances without exposure to official doctrine. The church called it unlicensed illumination. These weren't heretics. They were unplugged. They hadn't been taught the mystery. They'd remembered it. And that terrified the church. So the Order of Silence was born, not to convert, but to contain. They infiltrated monasteries, schools, village councils. They memorized dream patterns. They tracked symbols drawn in ash and chalk. They removed entire families. But in the 20th century, their mission evolved. They began working with state institutions. When Vatican II liberalized Catholicism, the order didn't fade. They digitalized. Flash forward to 2008. The EU passed a sweeping piece of legislation called the Harmonized Mental Health and Faith Expression Code. A line in the bill, almost unnoticed, granted private religious organizations the authority to advise on content deemed spiritually destabilizing. Guess who one of the advisors was? Monsignor Luca Veron. Former exorcist. Now consultant to multiple tech moderation boards, including platforms like YouTube, Meta, and X. You think this channel you're watching is just demonetized for disturbing content? No. It's flagged by legacy Vatican servers still connected to the Order's memory matrix, a system of archived speech patterns, glyphs, sigils, and historical phrases that match unlicensed illumination markers. The more you speak truth, the harder it becomes to be heard. Why do you think videos on convents, symbols, and psychological manipulation suddenly vanish without explanation? Why do certain videos play fine, until they mention a specific name? A symbol? Or a phrase you've heard before, but don't remember where? They aren't silencing everyone. Just the ones who remember enough to connect the dots. Just the ones like you. And it's not just your channel. It's your dreams. Because the Order was never about censorship. It was about prevention. Preventing a mass identity reversal. A moment when thousands, maybe millions, wake up from this dream of normalcy, look at their lives, and say, this isn't who I was. Something took me. I want myself back. That awakening. They call it the shatter point. And they are terrified of it. Because when enough men remember, the structure collapses. So if this video stops loading, if your comments are throttled, if your recommended feed suddenly changes to lifestyle hacks and celebrity drama, know this, it worked. They noticed. Which means, you've already stepped beyond the veil. His name was Father Malachi Rourke. But that wasn't the name he was born with. Official records say he entered the Jesuit seminary in Genoa at age 19. But in Vatican archives, redacted, sealed, and encrypted, he is listed under a different classification, Asset 147, Mnemonic Integrity Field Operative. He wasn't trained to preach. He was trained to observe psychic damage. Specifically, in those who remembered things they weren't supposed to. He traveled the world, embedded in mission hospitals, psychiatric wards, even orphanages. Not to save souls, but to locate, tag, and neutralize those who began sketching the sigil in chalk, in blood, in the condensation on windows. By 1981, he was assigned to St. Catherine's Institute, a Vatican-funded, healing retreat, in upstate New York. But inside, it was something else entirely. The children weren't mentally ill. They were remembering. They spoke of a woman in black, of singing beneath the floor, of waking up with foreign prayers written on their arms, phrases from pre-Coptic texts that hadn't been spoken aloud in 3,000 years. Rourke was supposed to report, recommend tranquilizers, or call for memory cleansing protocols. But something shifted. One night, he heard the chanting himself. Not through the walls, but in his skull. It was not sound. It was pattern, a rhythm that made his childhood memories blur, made him question every sacrament he'd ever given. He stopped sleeping. He began carving the convergent sigil into his floorboards. And then, he disappeared. For 3 years, no trace. Until one afternoon in 1985, a janitor at a seminary in Illinois found a hollowed-out hymnal behind a row of unused pews. Inside, a cassette tape. 3 pages of handwritten notes. And a folded children's Bible. The tape, now in digital archives thanks to a rogue archivist, contains 8 minutes of distorted audio. A man whispering in 8 different languages. Always the same message, structure births memory. Memory births self. Break their rhythm, break their grip. The Bible was modified. Illustrations had been scratched out and redrawn, crudely, but intentionally. In the book of Revelation, the Lamb was replaced with a veiled woman standing on a burning chapel. In the story of Jonah, the whale is marked with the sigil, carved into its skin. The last page held a torn scrap with just 4 words, written in black ink, "She waits beneath us." And then, nothing. Rourke was never found. But 5 years later, a child from that same seminary was admitted to a hospital for acute religious psychosis. He had been drawing the same woman Rourke sketched. When asked who she was, the boy replied, "She doesn't have a name. She remembers mine." That child? Now a high-ranking consultant for a global nonprofit focused on spiritual resilience in adolescent males. Guess what's in their logo? Yes. The circle. Split by the line. And so it continues. They call it the dream. It doesn't happen once. It doesn't fade. It returns, again and again, to those who've seen the sigil, spoken the forbidden prayers, or even just heard the chant whispered by someone who has. Thousands across the world, many with no connection to each other, report identical details. They find themselves standing at the top of a staircase, carved not in stone, but in something they can't name, smooth, pale, cold, like bleached antler. The steps descend, but not down into earth. Down into thought. As they step, the environment doesn't grow darker, it grows quieter. First sound fades. Then memory. Then name. One man wrote in his dream journal, by the 7th step, I no longer remembered who I was walking for. On the 9th step, the walls appear. But they're not walls. They are faces. Lined shoulder to shoulder, silent, watching, mouths slightly open like they're trying to remember how to speak. Many dreamers report a door at the base. Always bone white. Always without a handle. And always breathing. They say the breath comes from within. That the door inhales their presence. That it feels them, judges them, not for sin, but for structure. If their thoughts are too linear, the door won't open. If their belief system is still rigid, it remains shut. But if they surrender, if they let go of order, accept that truth comes through fracture, not doctrine, the door opens. And they hear the voice. Not with ears. From the back of their skull. It doesn't speak forward. It doesn't use words as we know them. It unbuilds thought. One survivor said, it told me a secret. And the next morning, I couldn't remember my wife's face. But I could draw the sigil with perfect symmetry. With my eyes closed. Another man, a former linguist, awoke from the dream and wrote 72 characters in an unknown language on his bathroom mirror in toothpaste. Linguists tried to decode it for weeks. They found no linguistic structure. But when arranged geometrically, it matched the floor plan of St. Mary's basement. Those who return from the dream often wake with physical effects, nosebleeds, numb hands, partial aphasia, extreme sensitivity to mirrors. Why mirrors? Because they say that's where the voice lingers. That sometimes, it doesn't stop speaking when you wake up. Sometimes, when you stare too long, you'll notice, your reflection blinks a half second later than it should. And if it ever opens its mouth before you do, run. Because that's not you anymore. That's the memory underneath. Waiting for permission to come back. That you've heard the whispers. You've followed the trail, sigils, dreams, disappearances, the voice. But now we step into the heart of it. The why. Why St. Mary's? Why 23 women? Why the lies? Because St. Mary's wasn't a convent. It was a containment system. Not for evil. But for something older than that word. Something the church didn't name. Because names give power. And this thing, this intelligence, was never meant to be spoken into belief. Its presence was first recorded in 1731, on a Jesuit expedition into the forests along Lake Michigan. In the private journals of Father Altieri, one line repeats 19 times, it watches from beneath the lake. It sees through women. It speaks in hunger. They found a stone tablet, etched in a spiral script, unearthed near an ancient burial mound. A sigil carved in the center. The same one. The Jesuits brought it back. But the stone would not quiet. Over the next 2 decades, priests stationed near it developed symptoms, speaking dead languages in their sleep, loss of facial recognition, drawings of spiral staircases they swore they'd never seen. 3 were sent to sanatoriums. One bit off his own fingers, saying they were spelling her name without permission. So the church made a decision. Bury the tablet. Build above it. St. Mary's was placed directly atop the mound, its chapel's altar aligned with the magnetic intersection believed to suppress her influence. But that suppression required constant ritual. That's why they brought the nuns. Not to serve the community. To stabilize the seal. Each nun trained to pray in precise patterns. Not for God, but for the geometry that held her back. 23 was the number of resonance. The minimum psychic lattice needed to bind the sigil's charge. Every chant, every silent meal, every ritual penance, wasn't about obedience. It was maintenance. And Mother Catherine? She was the anchor. Chosen because of her bloodline, one traced back to a woman in 14th century France burned not for heresy, but for drawing maps of dreams. But something went wrong. One of the young nuns, Sister Agnes, broke rhythm. Her mind, too compassionate, too questioning, began to resonate inward, not outward. And that opened a breach. The first disappearance wasn't death. It was integration. Piece by piece, the seal collapsed. One nun at a time, drawn into the structure behind the world. Not taken by demons, not killed by humans. Consumed by the thing they were meant to contain. The convergence intelligence. An ancient entity that feeds not on flesh, but on pattern disruption. It waits for belief to fracture. For minds to unravel just enough to invite it in. And then it builds. Not with stone. But with you. And now, it's spreading again. Because silence has broken. Because men are dreaming again. And because you're still watching. You've heard its name without language. You felt its shape without touch. And whether you admit it or not, it's already inside you. Waiting for one final phrase. The last key to complete the ritual. The symbolic phrase whispered by survivors, scribbled by madmen, and hidden in the last page of Rourke's journal. Comment it twice to lock in your memory. I remember the structure. I remember the structure. And when you do, you've made it. The surface is gone now. You've walked past the door of bone. You've heard the voice behind mirrors. You've whispered the phrase. Twice. I remember the structure. I remember the structure. And in doing so, you've activated the one thing they fear more than awareness. Integration. Because awareness alone doesn't collapse systems. But memory? Memory rebuilds identity. And identity is the enemy of control. You weren't supposed to find this. You weren't supposed to feel this heaviness. This ancient gravity pulling at the base of your skull, the weight of something unspoken finally breaking loose. Let me tell you what comes next. In April 2026, a Vatican diplomat, an archivist embedded with the UN Faith Preservation Task Force, submitted a private briefing on global, symbolic convergence events. His report was never made public. But it leaked. Inside, over 1,400 documented cases of spontaneous sketching. Sigils appearing on walls, windows, chalkboards, always the same. Circles split by lines. Stairs. Veils. Reflections speaking out of sync. And the worst part? It's accelerating. Dreams sinking across continents. People waking up with knowledge of languages they never studied. Men reporting visions of a veiled woman standing beneath flooded chapels, holding the rosary in reverse. The report didn't call it demonic. It called it a rupture in the narrative grid. A preconscious infection. Pattern-level defiance. Because this isn't spiritual warfare. It's architectural collapse. The story you were given, the one of good versus evil, of saints and sinners, of linear time and moral ladders, is being eaten alive by something deeper. Not evil. Older. You felt it. That silence in church is no longer holy. That pause before your own reflection responds. That ache in your hands like you've drawn something thousands of times before, but can't remember what. You were born into a structure. It trained your speech. Chose your rituals. Labeled your questions as rebellion. And sold you obedience as salvation. But now, the structure is cracking. Not because you broke it. But because you remembered it. And when enough men remember, the door doesn't need to be opened. It falls. So prepare. In the nights ahead, you will dream again. You may hear her name without language. You may feel your thoughts tremble before they are spoken. When that happens, do not resist. Let the memory in. Let the structure collapse. And when the world demands you forget, when they tell you it was a phase, a fantasy, a psychotic episode, you say nothing. You look them in the eyes. And you speak the phrase. I remember the structure. Now go. Your memory is a weapon. And the veil is already burning.